As photographers, we are always looking for the best photo possible. But there's one question we can ask before making any individual picture to take it from a good exposure to potentially a piece of art. So, I have a confession. I filmed this whole tutorial out in the field and things seemed like they were going great. I managed to capture some great examples of what I wanted to demonstrate today. The scenery was beautiful and I was even approached by some wild horses. But although my microphone and wireless receiver were both on and working, all the audio sounds like this. What is it about climbing steep hills that just can't resist? I certainly can't anyway. Yep, what you just heard was the internal microphone of the camera that I use for filming my videos. Unfortunately, the wire that I used to plug my wireless microphone into my camera wasn't pushed in properly, so the audio where I was talking to the camera just isn't usable. But thankfully, I got loads of great footage and the pictures I got really made the point of what I want to show today. And the question that we want to ask before we even think about pressing that shutter on our camera is, how can I simplify this image? And in this video, we're going to discuss 3 main ways that we can do that. Let me show you what I mean. By the way, this video is brought to you by the Joshua Pegg Photography Club, but a bit more on that later. Now, the first way we can answer the question, how can I simplify this image, is by asking, what can I cut out of this picture? Now, this was really important in the location that I was on this day. When I first arrived, there was a glorious sunrise coming up over the hill. I could see in the sort of twilight in the distance that there were a group of wild horses, and I saw all these craggy rocks that I could take pictures of. There was just so much choice of what I could take a picture of. And with the example of the picture that I showed at the beginning of this video in the intro, that was quite a cool picture. I felt that it was appropriate for the introduction. But would you call it a piece of art? Personally, I'm not so sure. It's certainly not going to be part of my portfolio. It was a pretty good picture, but I wouldn't call it art. And the reason for that is, if you have a look at it, there is a lot in this photo. You've got the sunrise coming over the hill, that craggy rock going up to the side there, and a leading path, a village down in the valley. And all of these things are elements that you might want to take a picture of. But when you cram them all into one photo, it can look quite messy, almost beginnerish, that photo. But a little bit after I took this picture, I went on to take this next picture. Now you'll notice that this is just a part of that picture that I took earlier. I just looked to the left a bit, zoomed in, and concentrated on one element in that photo. As a result, we get a much simpler, much more artistic looking photo, in my opinion, to my eye. And the reason for that is, if you look at the bottom, we've got this lovely leading line created by the rocks in the foreground, the lead up to the crag that was peeking up over the horizon. The sun and light still play a strong part in this image, but they're not playing a main role. They are simply lighting our subject. And if you have a look really close, there are some small details in this that add to it without being distracting. If you look, there's a little sheep just climbing that crag. He was making his way up to the top to try and get some of that sweet, sweet grass at the top, I think. But that tiny detail isn't a distraction, it's an addition to the photo. Whereas with the previous one, there is a lot going on. And it's a sort of thing I often describe as being an office wall picture. You'd see it on an office wall and you wouldn't give it a second glance. Whereas the second picture, that looks like it's part of somebody's portfolio. I'm not sure it quite makes my portfolio, this one. We'll see. I haven't made my mind up yet. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think this is a portfolio-worthy picture? There's this trail in the sky from a plane that flew over. I could clone that out to fix it, but for me, that kind of ruins it. It's a very distracting element of this picture. Other than that, there is potential that it could be a portfolio picture. So that's the first way that we can simplify the picture that we want to take to make it more artistic. What can I cut out of my frame? The second part is, how can I frame my subject? Now, I did this in last week's video when I showed some demonstrations of street photography. Now, street photography isn't a thing that I get to do very often. I live in rural mid Wales, so cities aren't on my doorstep. I have to travel to them. But when I do go, I love street photography. It's a really great way of making your mind think about composition a lot more. You have to think really quick with street photography. Unlike landscape photography, when you've got a bit of time while the light's nice to think about your composition, lining everything up perfect. With street photography, you have to plan your composition before it happens. And that's exactly what I did. If you have a look at this picture here, this first one, you've got this lady who happens to be my wife walking up a path. This was one that I planned, but I used her as an example. I could have just waited for somebody else to come up this path, but I used my wife because she was there. Now, as you can see, what I've done here is, because it was a really flat light day, I couldn't use light to my advantage in this, so I've framed my subject. As you can see, as she walks up this path, you've got two leading lines leading towards her and that come over the top of her and frame her nicely. And what this does is it draws the viewer's eye into that subject. When you've got them framed, it makes it very obvious to the viewer what they are supposed to be looking at. And that's a great way of simplifying your image. If you keep that in mind of how can I make sure my viewer knows what they're supposed to be looking at, that will be a massive help in order to keep your photos simple and more artistic. This second example of street photography again, this was an example where I waited for my composition to happen. You can see this archway framing my subjects nicely again. I waited for somebody to walk through, and really frustratingly, I missed out so much on this composition because I fell into the trap of chimping. If you don't know what that is, it's when you look through your viewfinder and you think, I've got the settings right, look down. Look up through your viewfinder, look down to check your settings. And because I did that, I missed a cyclist coming through this archway. My wife caught it on camera. She was filming me doing it, and that would have been a really good composition, getting that cyclist coming through. So that was my own fault. I deserved to miss that composition. I should have just got my settings right and stuck with it. But still, we've got a composition here that frames our subject. A great way of simplifying your image, making it more artistic. Now, before we go on to our last point, and probably one of the best ways to simplify your image, and actually the example I'm going to use is one of my favorite images I've got in a long time. Before we discuss that, I just want to talk briefly about the Joshua Pegg Photography Club. Now, what is this? Well, pretty soon, at the bottom of my videos, you're going to notice a join button. And that's because I'm starting channel memberships. It's a great way of supporting the channel and enabling me to carry on making these sorts of tutorials and helping you to learn photography. But I don't want to just make it a way of you supporting the channel. If that's what you want to do, then I genuinely really appreciate that. But I want to make it something that's good for you, gives you value as a viewer. So I've got a few plans with it. As more people join, I'm going to add more and more to it. I've got a few things in mind, like zines, examples of my work, lessons within those zines as well, tips about how you can get the same photos that I have. And I'm even planning a specific preset pack on Lightroom for channel supporters. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I'd like to be able to give you something for showing your support to me as a way of thanking you as well. I don't want it to just be you supporting me. I want you to get something out of it. So I just wanted to briefly mention that before we go on to this point here. Now, with the last way of simplifying our images, we need to ask ourselves, how can I light my subject? Now, something that is very often overlooked in photography, especially as a beginner, is the way that you use light. Light is the most important thing about photography. If you think about it, every time you open your shutter, you are letting light into your lens. So really good light means a really good photo. If you think about it like that, that'll help you to think about this part before you take your image more often. For example, these wild horses that I saw at this location were, I couldn't believe they were that close to me. When I pulled up in my van into the car park, the spot that I'd chosen, I had planned the craggy rock to the left-hand side. I knew there were wild horses in the area, but I didn't expect it to be quite so close. They were about 100 yards away from where I parked. Although they're wild, they're not particularly scared of humans. I kept my distance because at the end of the day, human interference isn't good for them, and I wanted to respect that. So I even went off the path and walked well around them because they were really close to the path. But one common mistake is to try and include a lot again. So I took a picture of the horses near my van. That's an example of what a beginner might do. Quite a messy scene again, lots in it. You could see why a beginner might take it. You've got the horses, you've got where they parked, you've got the rolling hills in the background. You think, oh yeah, it's great including all this detail. It tells a story, but it's not very artistic. Whereas this image, I put on my zoom lens on my camera and I got right in on the detail. If you notice with this particular picture, I didn't even include the whole horse. I just concentrated on his eye. and you'll see why now. If you have a look at his eye, it is really sharp. That's what I was aiming for. A little side tip for you: when a viewer is looking at a picture and it's of a human or animal subject, the most important thing to have in focus is their eye, because that's where our eyes are naturally drawn. You're looking at my eye right now. You're not distracted by this here, are you? You might be now that I'm pointing at it, but through this whole video, you've probably likely been concentrating on my eye more than anything else. That's true in photography. If you notice around the horse, everything else is blurry. His leg is blurry because he was trotting along at this point. His fur is blurry because it was moving in the wind, and the background is blurry because I was tracking him as he was moving. But his eye is sharp, and because of that, it tells more of a story in this picture. You can see that this horse is in motion. Also, take note of the way that the light is hitting him. This subject is completely backlit from the rising sun that was coming over the horizon. Because of that, it really makes him stand out against the background. Now, there's lots of ways that you can use light in your pictures. The one that we don't want is harsh light, where you get really harsh shadows or contrast on the face. If you get half and half, that can work, but when you get shadows across the nose and under the eyes, that can be a really ugly look. But because this subject was backlit, you can see there's nice even light on his face, but he's surrounded by a glow that makes him stand out against the background. The viewer is in no doubt about what they're supposed to be looking at in this picture. And because of that, I do think that this is a portfolio picture. I've managed to create what is in my eye a piece of art, simply because I took the simplest composition possible. You can't get much more simple than taking a picture of the front of a horse. But it's simplicity that takes this from being a good exposure to a piece of art. And that's the message that I want you to take home from this video. When it's very easy to be distracted by a lot of things in your frame, think, how can I cut things out? How can I frame my subject? How can I light my subject? Answering those three questions will help you to simplify your image and create something that is much closer to a piece of art. And you really will notice a difference in your own photography. Now, one way a lot of people overcomplicate their images is in the way that they edit them as well. Well, this video here will show you how you can edit pictures in a really simple way to really make your subject stand out and to keep that image nice and simple. I'll see you next time.